Hello, Pastor Stuart here with this week's midweek Bible study. We continue our reading through of the book 1 Thessalonians, which was the Apostle Paul's letter to the new Christians at the church in the city of Thessalonica in Greece. We jump into chapter 2 today of 1 Thessalonians, and if you missed the introductory discussion and our reading of chapter 1, then you can pause this video, go back and watch those if you want to, or you can just keep plowing through and we'll make sure to cover what you missed. In chapter 2, Paul hints at what happened in both Thessalonica and in the place where he was before that, in the city of Philippi. And if you're curious to read some of those details, you can go to Acts chapter 16 for when he was in Philippi and Acts chapter 17 when he was in Thessalonica, and read the details of what happened while he was in those two places. In Philippi, Paul and his missionary partner Silas were beaten and imprisoned by an angry mob. Then the next day, after spending the night in jail, the magistrates released them and apologized, and then afterwards is when they kept traveling on to Thessalonica. And if you remember in our previous discussions, in the city of Thessalonica, after they'd only been there a few weeks or maybe a couple of months, again, some people didn't like that they were causing trouble, it said, with their message of Christ's love and grace. So those people, again, started an angry mob and ran Paul out of town. So he had back-to-back some really hard locations and really tough work. And he'll mention those as we read in chapter 2. And as we read, we'll also pick up on some subtle points that were running themes in a lot of Paul's letters, something that he had to put up with and struggle with a lot, and that was criticism. He was constantly criticized by other Jews, by other leaders in the Christian church, and by non-believers. They accused him of things like not respecting Jewish law or worship practices or not preaching the gospel correctly. So often when he would come into town and start preaching and teaching about Jesus, either the locals would get mad and run him out of town, like in Thessalonica, or as he kept traveling, other missionaries would travel behind him, go to the places that he'd been, talk to the folks that he had helped come to Christ, and talk to the new churches that he had helped start, and say, oh, it's good that we're here. You might have heard some things from Paul, but here's the rest of the story. Here are the rest of the rules you need to follow and the laws you have to abide by in order to be real Christians. Like that was part of what happened in Galatia, and it's why his letter to the Galatians was so angry and he was so upset, because of the missionaries who had come after him and were trying to change the gospel message that he had preached to the Galatians. So all the time, people were trying to discredit him and the gospel that he preached. So that's one thing that he's worried about as he writes the Thessalonians, especially since he had to leave before he was ready and leave in the midst of a lot of turmoil. He's worried that they might believe other messages that they hear. They might believe bad rumors about him. Some of the things that the local church leaders in Thessalonica said that these are the people who've caused trouble everywhere. We should run them out of town. So Paul's worried that the Thessalonian Christians might listen to those messages. So as he often does in many letters, he writes to justify himself and his work, his mission, and the gospel that he preaches. So let's start reading the first few verses of chapter 2, and I want you to listen for characteristics of integrity. Remember, Paul's trying to show that his message, the gospel of Christ, is the true message of love and integrity as opposed to the other things that were being spread around about him. So listen for characteristics of integrity. I'm going to read 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 6a. I'll stop right in the middle of verse 6. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not a failure. We had previously suffered and been insulted in Philippi, as you know, but with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in spite of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as men approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please men, but God, who tests our hearts. You know we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from men, not from you or anyone else. So, what are some characteristics of integrity that you heard while we were reading? Some things that stood out to me were first, resilience and endurance. He talks about all the suffering he's had to go through, but they didn't give up. Usually people who lack integrity, they'll kind of fall at the first sign of pushback or sabotage. But Paul is resilient, and he endures because he knows how grounded he is. He knows the truth and validity of his work and his message. Also, he is upright. And he says he did not have impure motives. So he's doing the good work of evaluating what his motivations are, evaluating the purity and honesty of those motivations. And he says that they are from the Lord, that he feels commissioned and called by God. And that's why he says he's trustworthy based on God's testing of him, God's evaluation of him, that he's trustworthy. And because of that testing, he says he's reliable, that you can rely on what he's saying. And there, those final verses, he says that he was honest both about himself, and you can tell that he was straightforward with the Thessalonians. He says, we didn't try to use flattery for you, so he was straightforward with them and didn't try to, really puff them up just to get in their good graces. Nor did we try to cover up our true selves or any kind of greed. So he was honest about himself, and he was honest about them as well. So those are all the characteristics of integrity, some that jumped out there. Since false teachers would regularly come after him and confuse the folks who Paul helped to become Christians, he really wants his readers, the Thessalonians, to help understand what real integrity looks like, as opposed to false teachers or other preachers, missionaries who were doing it because they were really just power hungry. It was about their own ego. They just wanted a following. They just wanted influence, or they were sticklers to the old law, which Paul says doesn't apply anymore because of grace. So Paul really wants the Thessalonians to know what his motives are and what the other people's motives are. And he wants them to look for and notice the integrity. And you can kind of imply a few things from these verses about those other preachers and teachers and missionaries. You can kind of imply that they did use flattery, or they were looking for praise, because Paul says we weren't doing that stuff. So maybe those other preachers and teachers were just flattering the Thessalonians, saying like, oh, you guys are awesome, you're great, you don't have to change, you don't have to do any of that hard Jesus stuff, you don't have to love your neighbor as yourself, you don't have to sacrifice anything, you're great, just like you are. Don't even worry about having to sacrifice or give or love others, etc., etc. No, you're great. Flattery to puff them up, get in their good graces. And maybe they were looking for praise, these other preachers and teachers, and trying to say, oh yeah, I've got the most followers, I've started the most churches, Everybody knows I'm right. I know all the answers and all the scriptures, et cetera, et cetera. But both those actions, flattery, looking for praise, it's just vanity. It's just vanity for oneself, and it's stoking the vanity in others for your own devices. Now, when I think about that, when you think about that, you might think, well, I would automatically see through anybody who does that stuff, right? Someone who's using flattery on me or who is looking for praise, I would see through that. I'm not going to be swayed. Let's see, Paul says, we're not trying to trick you. Yeah, so everyone says, I wouldn't be tricked by those tactics, flattery, or someone looking for praise. It would be obvious, right? Paul does not think it is very obvious. That's why he has to write a letter explaining what good traits are and what bad traits look like and what integrity looks like so that the Thessalonians can recognize it. No one ever thinks that they've been tricked or swayed by flattery and someone who's looking for praise. No one thinks they have. But have you ever known someone who has? Have you ever seen them or groups of them? People who have been swayed or tricked by flattery and folks who are looking for praise? Of course you have. We all have. And yet none of them think that they are susceptible to it. So Paul really wants people to notice. That's part of the danger. We don't think we would ever be fooled like that. And yet, so many of us are. And we probably all have. Like they say, flattery will get you everywhere. It makes people too much at ease. So be on your guard. Look for those characteristics of integrity. Don't be fooled and swayed by flattery or folks who are looking for praise. Okay, let's keep reading. In the next verses, I want you to listen for characteristics of gentleness next. So let me read the end of verse 6 through verse 8 and be thinking about characteristics of gentleness. As apostles of Christ, we could have been a burden to you, but we were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her little children. We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. Isn't that sweet? I think that is really sweet and really interesting what he says there. Since Paul is trying to prove himself and the strength of his message and his work, he could have come off super pumped up, like those other teachers and preachers, and said, you should totally listen to me. I'm never wrong. I've founded more churches than anybody. I've made more converts than anybody. I know the scriptures better than anyone else. I've memorized them all. I know the backwards and forwards. I know exactly what God wants me to do. Like I never mess up. Like I'm the best missionary out there is, et cetera, et cetera. Like that could have been a tactic that some, other missionary or teacher probably did use. But Paul does not. He doesn't try to come off as like the strongest strong man. Instead, he talks about being gentle. That's why it's really interesting to me, because it seems like these days, gentleness is sometimes looked down upon as if it is weak, or if you're gentle, then that's a weakness, and you're soft and you're wimpy and you give in and you yield too easy, or a flip-flopper or whatever. You'll see people bragging or campaigning about how they never compromise. They never ever give in and they never compromise. That's the opposite of Paul's humility and gentleness. So even though these days gentleness gets a bad rap because it's equated with being weak, Paul is certainly not weak at all. Just look at those first verses that we read in chapter 2, how he says that they have suffered. And if you go back and read the book of Acts, you'd see that by this time, it's pretty early on, He's already been thrown into prison, chased by angry mobs, been run out of town, and that won't be the only times. He'll be beaten, he'll be whipped, he'll be kept in other jails, and et cetera, on and on. So Paul was definitely not a weak person. He was very strong, and he endured a lot. Yet, he was also very gentle. Here, he says that when he was with the Thessalonians, he was like a mother caring for her children. He says, "We loved you so much." He says they were delighted to share their lives with them because he says, "You were so dear to us." Isn't that sweet? And it shows how you can be both gentle and strong. It's not an either or. It's not one or the other. You can be both and. You can be both caring and you can be firm. Like Paul said, that is a good representation of motherhood. I think motherhood is a good example of that truth, that you can be both caring and strong, gentle, but also firm, because mothers love with an overwhelming sweetness, and yet you don't want to cross your mama, right? You don't want to get on her bad side. If mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. When you were a kid, were you ever doing something you should not have been doing? And you look at your mom and she gives you the mom look, like laser eyes going right at you. I can't do it. I'm not a mom. I don't have the eyes for it. But it's like this look, it's like a split second, like look that communicates, like you get the look and it's your mom without any words saying, "I did not just see you doing what I think I just saw you doing. You better have not been doing that. But if you have, then boy, are you going to be in trouble when I can reach you with my hands again." You know what I mean? You know that look. And you don't want to get that look, right? You don't want to cross your mom. A good parent is firm and sets firm boundaries and rules, sometimes using great strength to enforce them, even if it's amidst the tears of the child who resists and doesn't like it. But the parent does it out of love, which should hopefully help you learn and realize and remember that you can be gentle while you are enforcing good behavior and right behavior, like a mom, like a mother. And verse 8 that we just read shows that Paul was acting out of love. He tells the Thessalonians how much he loves them. And again, that's really interesting. It's kind of remarkable because it's not every man who is comfortable telling people that he loves them. That is awkward for guys to do. Guys just don't easily say that to each other. Like if one guy said to another, "Hey, I love you, man," the second guy might be like, "Okay, great." The first guy's like, No, I love you, man." The second one's like, "Oh, this is so awkward because we're guys." Unfortunately, Paul was very strong and endured more than we will ever endure. And yet, he has no problem being honest and saying that he loves the Thessalonians. Maybe it is only the strongest men who are able to express that and to hear it and receive it. But Paul is a great example of honestly saying what is going on in his heart. And like he said, he didn't try and cover up anything. He didn't try to put on like a false face or a mask and pretend he was someone he wasn't. He's honest. And that means in his honesty, he tells the Thessalonians that he loves them. That's powerful. What if a child never heard that from their parents, that their parents love them? There would just be a distance, something maybe even unspoken that was shallow and not deep or nurtured, but just like the child was hanging loose and was not as really connected. Or if there was a group that never heard that their leader had a deep love and commitment to them and for them in their work together, then there wouldn't be a lot of trust from that group towards their leader to follow the leader in certainly doing hard things or going through challenging times. So that's a good inspiration for me. Now is a good time for me to say something like that. So I will follow Paul's good example, and I will say, if you are watching this, then I love you. First Baptist Church, Weaverville, I love you. I love you all so much. I love our great church and the great people in it. It is a church of sweet people who are caring and who are kind-hearted, but they are hard workers and they love. They are fun and weird and quirky and silly and just real people. And I love them. And I am thankful for our great church every day. A good thing to say, a good thing to remember. Let's follow Paul's example of being people who are strong, yet have integrity, but are honest with their gentleness. So I encourage you to do that this week. Be both strong and gentle this week. Have that kind of integrity. And I'll tell you, it's not easy. It takes hard work to remember, to be intentional. But that kind of hard work is what we will talk about next week as we keep reading in this chapter. So I'll see you next week. And don't forget, I love you.